why did we do this? Well, my husband and I, 7 years ago, we had our first psilocybin experience, actually nearly 8 years ago, with a Dutch guide. And it was so life-changing and so profound and healing that we'd already set up a number of other charities. And so we decided that many of the people in the charities we already looked after were afflicted with a range of mental illnesses. And in general, mental illness underpins most other kinds of suffering and disadvantage, like homelessness, domestic violence, unemployment, homelessness. Did I say that already? Yeah. And a whole range of other things that people experience. And so we realized that if these treatments could get to people in Australia legally, that there could be a lot more people who could get well. And one of the reasons we did that was we started to investigate the mental health epidemic that we have in Australia. And I don't think that Sweden's mental health epidemic is quite as bad as ours. But in Australia, 1 in 4 have a mental illness. 1 in 6 Australians are on antidepressants, including 1 in 4 older people over the age of 55. And it's estimated that 1 in 2 Australians will have a mental illness in their lifetimes. So the cost to human potential and contribution to community and just general happiness and well-being is enormous. And what we also found was that certain parts of the population had far worse mental illness and suicidality than other parts, like, for example, veterans and first responders, which would be the same in all nations. But we have an enormous amount of veterans in Australia, and their incidence of these sorts of mental illnesses and addiction and so on is much higher than the general population. But also this happens with farmers and accountants and doctors and others also. And the elephant in the room has always been the lack of innovation in treatments for mental illness for over 50 years. We've really had no innovation in treatments for that period of time. And there's been no improvement in treatment outcomes over the past 50 years. So in the case of depression, we're seeing remission rates of only about 15%, with huge amount of side effects and, of course, very difficult to withdraw from. And in the case of post-traumatic stress disorder, remission rates as low as 5 to 10%. So doing the same is not going to solve this huge problem, this huge wicked problem that we have. And so we set up the charity, as mentioned before, and I won't go through that particular focus again because it was beautifully enunciated by Mike. But for us, success means that these therapies become an integral part of our mental health system, that they achieve high remission rates like they're achieving in trials all around the world of 60 to 80% remission rates after just 2 to 3 treatments with a short course of psychotherapy. You compare that 60 to 80% against the 15% or the 5 to 10%, and think about how many people that you love and care for and your clients could be getting better, and just people who feel better and can live their lives more productively. And that these medicines are accessible and affordable to all Australians, regardless of where they're located or their financial circumstances. So we developed a strategy to build the ecosystem in Australia, and that includes awareness and knowledge building. So that's why we do these sorts of sessions with lovely people like yourselves, where we share knowledge and we educate people and we share what we've been doing. We're not trying to keep anything a secret. We're happy to tell you how we did what we did and why we're doing it, and it's all out in the open. So our focus has always been on the data and the science, and we have done many different kinds of events. So we do webinars like these and also very enormous ones. We have a global summit that we may run again, and we also run a lot of other presentations. And we present to different sectors in the community, not just people interested in this, but people who need to know about this, which could be government and regulators, a lot of clinicians who knew nothing at all about this field until we started educating them, many consumers, everything from policemen to lawyers, teachers, and schools across the community. We also started one of the leading professional development programs in the world. And this is our certificate in psychedelic assisted therapies, which has a world-leading faculty, which I'll show you shortly. And which trains, well, we've nearly trained, by the end of this year, we'll have trained about 500 psychiatrists, psychologists, GPs, other physicians, psychotherapists, counselors, nurses, social workers, occupational therapists, and other qualified allied health professionals. And we also work a lot with universities. So we secured our government's grant of $15 million towards research and development in this sector. So that supported 7 trials in Australia, and was the largest grant by any federal government in the world for this emerging field. And we also directly support funding and also a registry at the Australian National University, which is now capturing data from the psychiatrists who are treating patients and how the patients are going. And I'll talk further about that shortly. Of course, the biggest thing was to get patient access, and we've done that through extremely hard work with our regulators, applying to our Therapeutic Goods Administration over a period of a number of years, persistently and consistently, never giving up. And we're also very focused on medicine availability, ensuring that the medicines that we secure are very cost effective so that people are not getting ripped off and they're getting medicines at the most affordable rates possible. And we also started a patient support fund to support patients who are less fortunate through philanthropy to get contributions towards them getting treatments. And here's a little bit more about some of the key achievements over the past 5 years. And we've done a lot more than this, but this is just sort of high level. And we encourage you to look. Actually, Ilan, maybe you could put our latest blog into the chat so that people can see that latest blog if they want to read a bit more about how we've done what we've done and so on. And you can see here these extraordinary headlines that occurred after the 3rd of February in 2023. That was the day when we got the notification that these medicines had been rescheduled. And really, my husband and I, who had been persistently working on this for a number of years, really, we danced around our kitchen like we couldn't believe it. I kept saying, are you sure? Are you sure it says approved, rescheduled? Because I couldn't believe that Australia would be the first country that would do this. But we were. And this is very exciting because now patients in Australia are being treated. And Dr. Ted Cassidy is one of the first psychiatrists in Australia, and he's on this call, who's treating patients. So you can see here some of the historical context of what's happened, what we did. So, you know, the UN Convention, the war on drugs and all of that we all know about, that really stopped research and development in this field and treatment for 50 years effectively. And the renaissance, of course, that has led to this has been going for about the last 10 or 15 years with people like Roland Griffiths and David Nutt and other leading researchers who've been really still fanning the fires and keeping this field going and really restarting the field again over the last decade or so. And that has led to this outcome, which we are quite sure will be followed in many other countries now. And you can see here, of course, the fairly rigid conditions of this rescheduling decision. So you can see here that at the moment, these treatments, so MDMA can only be used for post-traumatic stress disorder and psilocybin for the treatment of treatment-resistant depression. And it can only be prescribed by registered psychiatrists who have become authorised prescribers. And Dr. Ted Cassidy is one of a number of authorised prescribers now in Australia, treating patients with these medicines and therapies. And those authorised prescribers have to present their protocol to a Human Research Ethics Committee and the TGA, after which they get a tick, which means they can start to practice with these treatments. So you can see here, like, the enormous number of rescheduling submissions that were received. Greater than 96% of these submissions were in favour of supporting this rescheduling decision. So again, you know, in Sweden, or if you do this in the whole of Scandinavia, it's really about developing a movement of people who really want to be part of this work, who want these medicines and therapies to be available because they want to have a healthier and happier community and families and workplaces. And that's really what happened, was that people said enough is enough. We've had enough of this ineffective, pretty useless mental health system where most of our patients are not getting well, and indeed patients were not getting well. And we were hearing the most terrible stories from people of their suffering from multiple years and sometimes decades of trying different treatments, and in many cases getting worse, not better. So you can see here what was the timeline once the rescheduling decision occurred, and that now patients are being treated. And of course, we've trained nearly 500 therapists as we speak. The key factors in developing patient access in Australia, and I believe anywhere in the world, is to train enough clinicians and therapists to make sure that you have people all over your country, including in the island, your GP, and what's that island called, like the island that lovely GP is from that he spoke about before. But anywhere, you know, wherever people are living, you need people who are trained in these therapies. That's absolutely critical. Supervision also of clinicians is very important, and obviously ongoing awareness and education, you know, of your community, so that people are very accepting and open to these treatments, and that they understand how beneficial they can be in the right set and the right setting with the right dose and the right trained therapists. We're constantly refining the treatment model as well as our training. And actually, we've had a lot of people come from Europe and the US to actually do this training, because most of our training program is online except for a 1-week intensive. So if any of you are out there thinking, wow, well, I want to do this training, then you should come register and then come visit us in Australia, and we will really welcome you with open arms. And of course, ethics and safety is critical. As well, the pricing. So the pricing of the medicines, the pricing of the treatments is very important. And then what are the funding gateways to make sure that these treatments can be accessible to people, especially when they're not yet on the pharmacy benefit scheme and not fully available. And that's things like we're talking, and we're being approached by a lot of health insurance funds. I mentioned our patient support fund before. Our Veterans Affairs Department, of course, sees the need in making these therapies available. And then we've started this registry that I mentioned before with Australian National University to collate real-world data from Ted, who's on this call, and about his patients and their progress, and potentially any adverse events or side effects as well. And then we help clinicians further develop their practices so they can efficiently screen and work with as many patients as possible in any given 3-month, 4-month period. And Ted may talk about that a bit more, about how he's setting up his practice. This is some of the trials in Australia and New Zealand taking place at the moment. So you can see there's a lot of psilocybin trials, and there's also a lot of MDMA trials. And obviously we're seeing an enormous amount of interest from the for-profit sector in this field. And there's a lot of people who are trying to cash in on this. Some of them, some who've started a few years ago have now fallen over. And it's really important for companies starting in this space to really think about what their value proposition is. I think all of you know just how beneficial these therapies can be, but I love some of these testimonials because they really help to educate people about what can be achieved. You know, 15 years of psychological therapy in one night. A patient said in the Israel MDMA trial, MDMA is the reason my son has a father instead of a folded flag. If everyone had these experiences, wars would be impossible to wage, etc. So there's many ways that you can help and that we can connect further. We love connecting with other nations. We have a great relationship with the EU in general, that whole group of people who are doing the work with the EU. We are in discussion with them all the time. We spend quite a bit of time in Europe each year. So we love Europe. My husband and I are both from Europe. And how you can help? Well, if you want to join our training, we can talk about that in the questions. We have wonderful content on our website. We obviously are a charity, so we have to raise money. So I'm sure you do too. I found that a very good strategy is talking just to your doctors. You know, I talk to every doctor I go to, and it's amazing how many of them have now started the training or attend our webinars and are very interested in this rapidly emerging field. We have a wonderful free webinar global series as well, which we'll talk about in a second as well. So this is about our patient support fund. This is our certificate in psychedelic assisted therapies. And this is some of our faculty here, and you will know a lot of these extraordinary clinicians. And then, of course, we also have these extraordinary people as well. So it really is like the most extraordinary faculty of teachers that are working with us. The upcoming webinars. So we have Professor David Nutt coming up. These are free webinars, but we encourage people to make donations. Dr. Terza Firestone, just an extraordinary teacher on intergenerational trauma. And Jim Fadiman on microdosing, and then Robin Carhart-Harrison. And we've got Rick Doblin coming up soon as well. So there's more to be announced. We also have some groovy merchandise. We have some beautiful little mushroom cards. We have Australia's first book of psychedelic healing stories, and we have some T-shirts. So I'm just going to stop the share there because we're going to invite some questions now and welcome Ted. Hi, Ted. How are you? You can unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'm unmuted. Perfect. Hi, how are you, Tanya? Thanks for inviting me.
No, it's a pleasure. So Dr. Ted is one of the first psychiatrists in Australia. He's done our training as well, and he's very involved in this field. And he might like to talk a little bit. Ted, do you want to just mention briefly how you're seeing this as a psychiatrist in terms of the screening and how many patients you can potentially see over would that be helpful, over a period of, say, every 3 months? Would you like to talk a little bit about this in
Yeah.
practice?
I suppose the first thing to say is that I'm a psychiatrist that's been interested in next step treatments for depression, anxiety, and PTSD. So I'm a bit unusual to this space in that there's a lot of people that come to this space very passionate about the psychedelics, whereas I really came to this space passionate about offering kind of disruptive treatments to patients. And to be honest, I've been involved in a number of kind of treatments that are fairly disruptive. But when I came across psychedelics, it just sort of drew me in. I just thought, here's an opportunity where you can get, single treatment. There's no other treatment where you can get sort of single treatments and have 20 or 30 or 40% remissions and long-term change after a single treatment. Yeah, not everyone's going to get that, but it's certainly there's enough people to actually make this a really interesting, exciting treatment. So that's how I came to this. In terms of the practicalities, as Tanya said, the rules all changed last year. I mean, the announcement was made of the down scheduling in February, but effectively from July 1, the regime where you were able to prescribe these medications came into place. At Monarch Mental Health Group, we'd already been involved, with clinical trials in this space, and a lot of the program that was put forward in Australia was really mirroring sort of clinical trial practice into clinical practice. So we have a schedule and we have a kind of a protocol that we have to follow. We don't have a lot of flexibility about it, and typically, for both MDMA and psilocybin, what we have is a set of kind of usually 3 1-hour integration sessions with 2 therapists, then an 8-hour dosing session, and then we repeat that 3 times over a 3-month period. So in terms of the practicality of setup, when we started screening for patients, as soon as I was an approved prescriber, which was around sort of late November last year, and we had our first MDMA-assisted therapy dosing session in mid-January. And then we had our first psilocybin assisted therapy dosing session in late February. And in both cases, I think they were pretty well one of the first in the world that's happened in a clinical environment. So we've now treated like 4 or 5 patients. We've gone through sort of multiple dosing sessions with each of those. And there's a number of things that really stand out for me. First of all, people really do get these sort of quite dramatic changes in relatively short periods of time. I mean, that's very evident. I think after the first couple of dosing sessions, I kind of was talking to people and I'd say, look, it feels like it's a year's worth of therapy in a day, which it is. It does. And I think particularly with MDMA, which is a very active process, that it definitely has that sensation. One of the other sort of learnings, it's from a practical point of view, the actual dosing session is quite different with MDMA and psilocybin. So MDMA, from a therapist point of view, is a really active process, and to be honest, yeah, it feels like a year's worth of therapy in a day, but it's also easier than a year's worth of therapy because it's amazing how patients kind of do all the kind of formulation themselves. They sort of do all the hard work themselves, which is and it's really you're almost just sort of hanging on there as a therapist. So it's actually incredibly satisfying and very quick. Psilocybin's a bit different. It's a much more silent session from the therapist point of view, and a lot of the work's done in integration. So that's a very obvious one, and people have spoken about that. One of the things that was probably less obvious, which I think is happened in a clinical program, is we because it's a clinical program, and these drugs are relatively available in the sort of underground world. The people that are coming to us as a clinical program are often paying quite a lot of money. They're often people that are a bit more anxious than average, and almost all are completely are drug naive, so they haven't had any extensive history of either psilocybin or MDMA. And what we found is that means the first dosing session you do is probably quite different than what might happen in an underground practice, and that a lot of the work has been done in just getting people kind of oriented to the experience. So we're actually finding that our most kind of dramatic dosing sessions are usually the second and third one, and that's particularly the case, I think, with psilocybin, maybe a little less so with MDMA. What are some of the other things? I made some notes which I'll sort of just pull up. I think the other thing that just from a practical point of view is and you wouldn't have thought that I did not expect this, the role of carers. So part of our protocol is if you come to the session, you have to have a carer drop you off and pick you up. And because there's not many of these programs, patients are often coming from quite a long way away in Australia. Australia is quite a big place, so people will travel down to our clinic in Melbourne. And so the carer is probably a bit more important. Not only are they picking them up and dropping them off, they're often spending the night with them as well. And we thought this would be a fairly kind of routine thing. But it turns out that, a proportion of people, maybe 20, 30% of people, it's almost our number one reason for not proceeding with the program, who can't identify a carer. Or they may request whether we'd be happy with having a paid carer, where they could literally hire someone to accompany them. And we've kind of pushed back and said, no, we really want you to have a carer. It needs to be someone that's known to you, that has some significance to you. It doesn't have to be family, but could be a friend or whatever. And as it's turned out, we've done a number of assessments on people where this has come up. The absence of a carer is really an indicator for a whole bunch of other things. So there's a whole bunch of contraindications that kind of follow. If someone says I can't provide a carer or pushes back on that, you can bet your bottom dollar that there's going to be 3 or 4 other things along the way that are going to make you a bit nervous about doing this treatment. So that became a really good screening question. I think if you're looking at the sort of mix, the patient mix that we found, I didn't really have any preconceptions. I suppose we had MDMA and psilocybin, so I just thought, well, it'll be 50% of each. But in reality, probably about 2/3 of our inquiries that we're getting around MDMA and PTSD treatment. So that seems to be, just from an inquiry point of view. And a little bit, and even within that group, it probably wasn't exactly what I was expecting either. Having spent a lot of time in clinical practice with PTSD patients, a lot of them in Australia are kind of first responders. So they're kind of military, police, AMBOs, fireys, those sort of people. And in reality, that's the minority that we're seeing. So of that 2/3 who are wanting MDMA therapy, probably 2/3 of those are predominantly female, and the main issues are domestic violence, sexual assault, trauma, probably some of the more complex PTSD compared to the typical sort of first responder trauma. So that's one of the things we saw. The other thing, I think Tanya mentioned the ANU registry, and we participate in that, and that's a great way of getting kind of good quality data about your patients in a very consistent way. If this were Australia, I was talking to a group of people. I'd be encouraging everyone to get on board with one registry. I mean, there's always a temptation to have lots of registries, or to argue about which exact rating scale is perfect. I think in a place like Australia, where we're really the first jurisdiction which is doing this in a clinical program, I think it's really important that everyone's on the same registry, even if it's not absolutely perfect. If we're all on the same, then we can actually start reporting national results rather than clinic by clinic results. And I think that, it's hard to see that when you're in Australia, but if you guys and you're outside, you're not interested in monarch mental health. You're interested in the Australian experience of psychedelic in clinical practice. So I think that's really important. Um, Practicalities like how many patients? Well, that sort of depends on how many dosing rooms you've got. So when we first started doing this, we were using our research facility and we had one dosing room. We've just opened up our new facility, so we've got three dosing rooms. And so we obviously don't want to have the approved prescriber, so me, in every single session, because that's not a very efficient use of time. And you want to, one of the practicalities of kind of delivering kind of mental health services is there's not that many psychiatrists, not that many really highly qualified clinical psychologists. And so if you're relying on those two groups as your only workforce, then you're not going to see a lot of people. So often it's about, to use a more businessy term, it's often about leverage. You've got to get your psychiatrist kind of supervising multiple treatments that are being delivered by other people. So our model, and we came up with three dosing rooms because that was the site that we had and it suited and we could get it going. I suspect you could easily have kind of 5 or 7 or 10 sort of dosing rooms. I do think once you got beyond that sort of 8 to 10, it does become a bit sort of unmanageable for the approved prescriber just to be across everything. But for us, what that means is that in our site, we do three dosing days per day, and we're not obviously not starting at that level, but potentially that's what we would do, 3 a day, so 5 days a week. And remember that each patient has a 3-month program, so you have the potential in our site to treat sort of 50 to 60 patients every 3 months across the site, or sort of 200, 220 patients per year. I think you could probably reasonably comfortably in a different site sort of move that up to sort of 5 to 7 dosing rooms so that you could sort of double capacity. What that means in terms of workforce, that's something we grappled with. So from the point of view of the psychiatrist, you probably don't want to be the approved prescriber every day of the week. So you probably need 4 or 5 psychiatrists to supervise that group of patients over the course of the year. So you're looking at a psychiatrist who's doing perhaps supervising one dosing day with 3 patients a day. So you're gonna have that psychiatrist supervising maybe 10 to 12 patients at a time over that 3-month period. So you need 4 to 5 psychiatrists. One of the real where it does become logistically complicated is the actual therapy takes up a lot of time. So I've been doing this with my sort of dyad partner. So, when we started this off, we didn't want to jump straight to supervising other people. We actually just did it ourselves, very hands-on, and it's incredibly time consuming. For every patient, there's essentially about 80 hours of therapist time over that 3 months, so 40 hours per therapist for one patient. So it soaks up a lot of time. Obviously, a big chunk of that's in the dosing day. So one of the logistic challenges is if you want to treat kind of 200 patients, you've got to find yourself 200 times 80 hours worth of therapist time, and that probably means and given that most people, well, nobody's going to want to do this full time. I mean, you couldn't do dosing days back to back. It wouldn't be possible. You'd be lucky to be able to do it more than once a week, I reckon. So you're going to need a head count of 20 or 30 or 40 therapists sort of managing this group of patients. So these are some of the kind of logistic things. We're in a really lucky position, I suppose, at Monarch, in that, you know, we've had an incredible amount of support from Mind Medicine Australia. I mean, Tanya mentioned the sort of training that I had early on, but just really practical things like, you know, being able to get hold of the drugs, get hold of the MDMA and the psilocybin. You know, My Medicine has been really great in sort of helping with that sort of logistic support and getting through the sort of regulatory hurdles, and there are a lot of those. I mean, that was a really big thing. I think the patient support fund. You know, when you've got that many therapist hours, the cost is an issue. So I think that's important. The ability to be able to sort of advocate and talk about these therapies. I mean, one of the reasons why people hear about me and Monarch and some of the other people that are doing it is because a lot of the advocacy work that Mind Medicine's done, and you know, they get a lot of people calling them up saying, where do I go for therapy? So I think all of those things have been helpful. I like it because it is a kind of service that you can deliver nationally. So, I mean, this is not unique to Australia. Australia is a big country, but there are other very big countries with remote areas. And one of the unique things about our program is a lot of all the sort of prep and integration is done by telehealth, and then the dosing days. So even in a place like Australia where people can be very remote, you're really asking someone to be in Melbourne for three lots of one day over a 3 month period, with everything else being done on telehealth. Yeah, there is an exception to that. Just on another practical, we kind of figured out, we're trying to think about what's the absolute bare minimum you can see someone face to face. Well, obviously you have to do it on the dosing days, and we wanted to do most of the integration and prep kind of by telehealth. But what we settled on was the first integration session, the morning after the first dose, was just really important to do in person. So we actually, you know, whenever we have a new patient starting, we'll do a dosing day, and then we'll make sure we're around in person the following morning to see the person. That seems to be a really critical sort of time to sort of, you know, make contact with people and sort of allow them to sort of debrief about what happened the day before. And you probably don't want to do. I think even in a scaled up program, even if you're trying to looking at cutting corners. What are some other things that we've looked at in terms of making it more efficient and practical? I pointed out the sort of big difference between the psilocybin day and the MDMA day. And I think there is an opportunity on the psilocybin day once someone has demonstrated that it's a fairly quiet day for them. So when you've seen them and it has been just really kind of, you know, watching someone have an internal experience. I think there is an opportunity to move that into more of a group setting, which I think would be good and would certainly save a considerable amount of money, because a big chunk of that 80 hours of therapist time is spent kind of in the dosing days. So I think that would be very helpful. I don't think you're going to be able to do that with MDMA. So, you know, from my kind of sense of what MDMA is, you know, literally in every case we've had an MDMA dosing day, it's followed almost the same pattern, that you give the dose, someone sort of lies down, maybe does some sort of meditation for an hour or so with their, you know, face mask on, you know, and then they literally sort of sit bolt upright somewhere between an hour and 2 hours and just start talking almost continuously for the next 4 or 5 hours, and then sort of gradually settling down right at the end of the session. So I would not like to do that in a group session, in a group setting. I think that would be a real missed opportunity. But yeah, so I mean, I think it is early days. I think there's going to be a number of people. I've been kind of thinking, well, what's this going to look like? Because there are some treatments, you know, if you look at sort of extremes of what makes a treatment, you know, because I mean, people like Tanya and Peter are very interested in how many people are going to be doing this and how available it's going to be. I think on one extreme of a treatment, there might be a treatment like TMS, magnetic stimulation treatment, which is so simple and straightforward that literally every doctor who has a practice could stick one in their back room and offer it. And then you've got something that's probably a bit more complicated, like a 60-bed hospital, overnight psychiatric hospital, where most doctors are going to not want to get involved in that because it's just too complicated, expensive to do. So they're the sort of two extremes. I haven't made up my mind yet where a psychedelic therapy, assisted therapy program is. It's certainly a lot more complicated than buying a piece of equipment and just sticking it in the back room. It's obviously not as complicated as a hospital, but I suspect it's probably going to be too complicated for most individual private practitioners. So I think what we're going to find over time in Australia, and it'll be interesting to see how, is that there'll be a number of kind of groups that develop it. It isn't that hard to set up, but it's not that easy either. So you have to have, systems around being able to manage kind of 20 to 40 therapists at a time. You need to be able to have multiple rooms. You need to be able to attract doctors. You need to be able to deal with some of the admin and the practicalities around it. So I think it's going to be something that is a lot more common than it is now. I don't know that I really don't believe it's going to be something that every psychiatrist is doing, and that probably the majority of psychiatrists that want to be involved and psychologists that want to be involved in these programs will probably choose to do it in a group that's already established a lot of the basic sort of infrastructure. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I could probably talk for hours on this, but I think I've covered a fair bit of ground. What do you think, Tanya? Is there any other questions you wanted
No,
to
I mean,
ask
I
me?
think you've done a great job, Ted. And I think it would be great now to open it up for questions, because I think we're going to have some great questions and let everyone speak. It's a small group. So we welcome your questions, and we'll try our best to answer them very well.
All right. Well, I guess I can start then. I already posed my question in the chat, but I'm really curious to hear how the conflict has evolved upon approval. Because you had it between, if I remember, some psychiatrists and the TGA and MMA. So please, how could you expand a little bit on how the situation have evolved?
Can you explain what you mean again? Just I don't quite understand the question.
Well, I don't know. I remember reading some article that it was psychiatrists opposing the fast down regulation that we saw. That they thought it would need some more time, and like this leading expert
Yes,
psychiatrists,
that was
a
that
group
was
of
the
them.
Royal College of Psychiatrists.
All right.
That's the
Yeah.
professional body, and there's just a couple of people, I guess a handful of people, who are very stuck in the status quo and hanging on to their patch of power. And would you
I
say
mean,
that, Ted?
yeah. I mean, what I'd say is, look, I think one of the problems with mental health that I see is that people are so conservative, and particularly in private practice and the practices, it's just so risk averse to doing things, even relatively low risk things like this, that people just do the same thing forever and ever. And that was one of my enormous frustrations, that you would get. I mean, the typical day for a psychiatrist is, when they first start out, they'll see a bunch of patients that are new. They'll get their third to a half of them well. They'll go away, and they'll keep the ones that don't get well. And so within a couple of years, the average psychiatrist seeing patients that they know well, that are half recovered, or even less than that sometimes, and they just do that forever. And they might change around the medications a bit, and the system kind of encourages that. So you have the psychiatrists in private practice is essentially case managing, depending on how hard they work and how often they see people, maybe a couple of hundred people up to maybe 1,000 people, all of them kind of chronically unwell, and that's a kind of good living. I don't
Rock the
think it's
boat.
just as cynical as it's good money, but it's a nice easy life, and why mess it up? Generally, the patients are appreciative, and generally you have done some good. So it's not like you're doing nothing. I mean, patients might be very unwell, and you've actually brought them to sort of half well and half stable. But for me, that just wasn't good enough. And I think that, first of all, I think that is good enough for a lot of psychiatrists. But for me and for quite a few other people, that isn't good enough. It's about, the job of being a psychiatrist and being mental health is getting people 100% well. And so, as I said, like being psychedelics weren't the first thing I thought of, though they were kind of well down the track, and I've tried lots of other different things. But the idea is that you when you get a group of people that don't get well, you start to think, well, how do we get you well? Now,
Mm.
I think the reality is that psychedelics was such an out there idea when people like Peter and Tanya started talking about it. Peter talked to me about it in 2018. I thought he was crazy. I thought, how is he? He'll never do this in 100 years. But you know, and here we are, kind of in 2024. And because of that, I think it probably was much more of a sort of a consumer sort of driven sort of approval. And I think that got a few psychiatrists' noses out of joint. I think that's fair to say. They're not used to patients kind of and patient advocacy sort of moving the agenda. But I think that's very short-sighted. And to be honest, I think the college, you know, there was a group within the college that probably didn't like it, but there was probably another group that just thought, oh my God, how do we scramble to catch up with this so that we don't look like we're being left behind? And
Well,
you know,
exactly. I
a
mean,
lot of it is.
we have well over 1,000 psychiatrists who've registered
Yeah.
interest in this. That's out of only a few thousand psychiatrists in Australia. So, you know, there's a lot of interest, but not just from psychiatrists. I mean, psychologists and doctors and others all feel very dissatisfied with the current treatments available. And, you know, obviously it is working with, you know, psychologists and other practitioners to deliver these treatments. So it's not just psychiatry led, it's all about this multidisciplinary team that you work with. And also that's really nice when you're a therapist that you can work with other therapists from different parts of the health profession. So you're getting this beautiful focus on the patient in the middle, and you're working with other people who all bring their skills and their tools to the table. That's a great thing about this treatment.
Yeah, for sure.
There
Definitely.
are two
We will
aspects,
see.
if I may.
Yeah, please. Sorry.
So I know that Tanya showed the slide previously where over 90% of the submissions to the TGA were in favor. Most of them came from consumers, but there was a high percentage of them which actually came from doctors as well. And I can tell you now they're just practically on the ground. That small group of researchers and also psychiatrists who spoke out publicly at the beginning of the TGA's decision to say that it was made very fast without much foresight, those voices have actually gone a lot quieter as well. And as psychiatrists like Ted move forward in terms of treating patients, you know, I think that there are a group of doctors who are trying to play catch up now, especially as the treatments move into the open. So much so that, you know, our training program, we've seen at least two other training programs pop up over here, but our training program is still the sector leader. And colleagues of those therapists who spoke out against the TGA decision are now doing our training program, and now they are converting their colleagues, you know, and speaking positively about MMA. So all in all, it's actually been a growth curve for us, and it's actually been a growing / pain point of just opening up a brand new sector, which was untested. But as people are getting used to seeing the treatments around, you know, I think now those ones who were speaking out, worst case scenario, they are just taking a wait and see approach, but they're definitely not speaking out like they did.
Thank you so much.
Just today, I saw a patient that was referred to me from the most conservative psychiatrist I've ever come across. A guy I've known for 20 years who I would never have thought would refer this. He's referred a patient for psychedelic assisted therapy. So, you know, on the ground, you can see it happening.
Amazing. So other questions that any of you have?
There's some good questions from Stefan H regarding sort of patient costs funding.
Yes, I did see that. Ted, I don't know if you want to speak about how our Medicare system works and how you can leverage that to help with the preparation and the integration sessions.
I mean, there is this, I mean, I suppose I'll speak to sort of what we're doing and what we can do about it. One one of the limitations of this treatment is the cost. I think in Australia, the cost is sort of between sort of $15,000 to $25,000 for a 3-month course, with probably the majority of programs being at the upper end of that range. Most of that is out of pocket because the way the Medicare system works, it rebates the psychiatrist time, but there's very little in the way of rebates. Most of it, as I said, if you're looking at the structure of it, it's really the kind of the labor intensity of this work. I mean, as I said, that sort of 80 to 90 hours of quite, skilled professional time is the majority of the cost. If you're looking at the drug cost in a typical psychedelic assisted therapy, out of that sort of 15 to 25,000, there might be $300 to $500 of drug cost. So it's not the drug; it's really about the professional time. There are there are a number of strategies to dealing with this. One is dealing with the actual therapy itself, and I think there is work being done on looking, particularly in psilocybin. I hinted at that idea of doing things the dosing days more in a group format, doing things with single therapists and using 2 therapists only on the dosing days. There's a number of kind of cost, from a practical cost saving points of view, by using kind of a different sort of clinician mix as well. So maybe not necessarily just using psychiatrists and clinical psychologists, but using psychologists or other kind of more counseling based psychotherapy.
And so, some doctors some psychiatrists are using nurses too.
Nurses, nurses are part of it. So that's that. And then on the other side, there's the rebate side. So what we're seeing is there's movement being made in our veterans funding to get sort of funding. There is discussions with various private health funds which are interested in this. And why wouldn't they be? One of the biggest growth areas for private health insurance in Australia is patients staying in hospitals, and mental health hospital stays has exploded. So they are very interested in treatments that are potentially disruptive and that break the cycle of recurrent hospital admissions. So that's something that's there. We talked about the sort of patient support fund run by MMA, which is really about a way of moving the not-for-profit sector to sort of assist people. Workers' compensation. So we have a number of kind of workers' compensation.
Yes, that's important.
Yeah, they're all sort of coming on board. So I think you're going to see, and I've been part of this with one other treatment. I kind of followed the whole cycle with transcranial magnetic stimulation, and it sort of follows that. You start getting a few of the insurers on board, particularly workers' comp and veterans. Once you get those on board, then you've got a business model that can operate. And then what happens is you start to draw in all the other groups because people start to see the results. And that's what I think will happen with psychedelics, because one of the remarkable things about psychedelic assisted therapy compared to everything else I've been involved in is people are just so interested in it. So people are kind of really wondering what the outcomes are. It's a really nice thing to be in. I've got to say, dealing with other treatments, you get people in the room and you've almost got to get them excited about the treatment. With psychedelic assisted therapy, you almost have to do the reverse. You get these people that are fully converted when they come into your room, and you've kind of got to sort of maybe reality test a few of their expectations. I mean, it's different, and people say, yeah, things could go wrong, but I actually think it's a nice position to be in, to be talking to patients about treatments they want.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you, Ted. You're doing such great work. Well, everyone, if you want to get our updates, please do put your emails. I know some of you already have into the chat so that we can send you our very informative newsletters, and we have all sorts of wonderful webinars that you can join us and so on and so on. I see that Carl has just put that in there. Thank you, Carl. And anyone else who wants to do that in the next couple of minutes, and we will definitely, I think, Mike, you're already on our list. I'm pretty sure you will be. And you're welcome to email us, absolutely. Send us any questions. If you want some support when you are, like, Mike, where is Sweden at with all this? Like, tell us, like, what's going on?
What's going on? So, I mean, we have just completed the first clinical trial in psilocybin-assisted therapy for depression at Karolinska Institutet. They're about to publish their results.
Yeah.
I haven't seen them yet. And they also recently started a new trial on end-of-life anxiety and cancer, which will be done at 3 or even 4 hospitals in Sweden.
Oh, yes, yeah.
So that's very interesting. There's a lot of sort of studies sort of in the pipeline as well.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we're quite
What about clinical use? Like, what about bringing it out in, like in the clinics?
I think there's quite a few years until that's going to happen. I think what will happen is if MDMA-assisted therapy gets approved in the US now in August, things will probably start happening quite quickly in Europe, and eventually Sweden will follow. That's usually the way it goes. But we're very seldom on the forefront when it comes to drug policy or drug-related things.
It's interesting because, the Scandinavian nations, and particularly Sweden and so on, are very progressive in so many different ways.
Except for drugs.
Well, call them medicines and maybe you'll get a different that definitely helps.
Yeah, that's definitely true. We need that medicine sort of stamp, and then we'll go pretty fast.
I mean, because like any drug, medicine can be abused. It can be a pack of Panadol can be overdosed on. So, who are we fooling? Anyway, look, yeah. Sorry, Mike.
No, so I was just going to point out that we're near the end of today's presentation or session. And just wanted to say, well, thank you so much for joining us, Elon and Tanya and Ted, from all the way from over Australia late at night. So, yeah, just we'll keep in touch.
We will. And look, if I think that, don't think it's a few years away. Like, like Ted said, he thought that, Peter and I would never achieve this in 100 years, and we did in 5 years. And I think now you can say, well, look at Australia. I mean, Sweden's a pretty formidable country, and, look at Australia, and you can take it up to your government, and you can really get the people behind you and the doctors and clinicians, and it'll be incredible, I think, to see what happens.
We're really looking forward to seeing some data from the naturalistic use of psilocybin and MDMA in Australia. That's going to help a lot.
And would you, you've got quite a big membership. Would you like Alan to send you this presentation so you can share the slides with your membership?
Yes, please. That would be great.
Okay, Alan, would you be able to shoot that?
Right.
Yeah. And yeah, please stay in touch with us. Keep, if we all keep working together on this journey, I think we're going to achieve a lot, and we're going to reduce an enormous amount of suffering, which is what matters the most. Because there is so much suffering in our world right now.
Yep.
And bring people together again from all this division and stuff. So let's bring people together. All right. Well, thank you all.
Very helpful, Tanya. Thank you so much for the presentation.
Thank you.
Good night,
Thank you
everybody.
so much. Thank you all. Take care. Have a beautiful day in Sweden.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Thanks, Ted.
Bye. Ja. Så jag avslutar inspelningen där.